Let's move to our final talk. Lucas?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Is the sound good? Okay, so I'm sort of exhausted. It's like almost 11 o'clock here, sort of closing time at the pubs, old school time. So and it's quite humid. So I hope I'm not too tired. Hold on, I want to share screen. I've got
Lucas, you should have a panic attack then.
Yeah, I really, that would really help. I'm not very good at panic attacks.
Okay.
Yeah, I should get angry. Yeah, maybe that's what I should do. Okay, so as I'm the last speaker, I thought I'd just begin by just thanking everyone. I've got to know Mark's work mainly through Jed and Uz, who's one of my former PhD students, and Mark jointly supervised his PhD, and I kind of got to know Mark's work a lot better, and I've really appreciated over the previous few years getting to know the interactivist model. For the last 6 months, some of you have been taking part. We've been having a reading group that sort of merged out of a CogSci philosophy reading group I've been doing for 10 years. For the last 6 months, we've been reading Mark, and then that reading group turned into the pre-conference reading group. And we also then spent a month and a half reading stuff before. So I've really learned a lot from that too. So I'd like to thank Mark, and I'd like to thank everyone at the reading group who've basically taught me most of what I'm going to try and talk about today. So I really like Mark's model, but unlike Robert, who's into this sort of unity, my sort of attractions are towards a certain type of pluralism. So I tend to be someone who's quite into sort of eclecticism, quite into pluralism when it comes to the philosophy of science and when it comes to explanation. Yeah, and so I think it's perfectly possible to combine Mark's sort of picture as a sort of ground floor picture of emergence together with using the sort of explanations you find offered by people like Milligan, people like Nicholas Shea in cognitive science. So I think these two forms of explanation are compatible. I don't think Mark's model rules out these other types of explanation. And I think there are reasons you might like these other types of explanations. They're not going to be foundational in the way that Mark's model is, but they may have other sorts of roles and virtues. So I'm quite Leibnizian here. Yeah, I found in most of the sects are right in a good part of what they propose, but not so much in what they deny. And so I'm in like this sort of pluralism. So I take it that as I understand the kind of dialectic, both Mark and Ruth Milligan, they both offer theories of representation that I think in a very broad sense can be understood as in terms of teleosemantics. I think they both agree that representations have an essentially normative character and that their normativity should be understood by appealing to some notion of function. And so I take it the fundamental difference has got to do with their accounts of function. So Milligan, and I take it the majority view in cognitive science for people interested in these issues, they offer kind of an etiological account of function, according to which the function of a thing is to be understood in terms of what it has been designed to do or been selected for, either by evolution or by learning. And so according to this sort of account, what I'm going to call Milligan functions and Milligan representations, whether or not a thing has a particular function depends upon the history of the thing. So I'm just going to set my alarm so I know when I've spent too much time. Okay, I've started my timer. Yeah, so could you warn me when I get to about 35 minutes? Because I'd like to keep this talk short. I'm aiming for 35 minutes. I'm not very good at aiming at things, but if you warn me at 35 minutes, I'll know when to Yeah, so
Okay.
I take it,
Is it
Mark
on
in
purpose
contrast
that
argues that we should
can't
understand.
see? Lucas, is it on purpose that we
Can
can't
you not see me?
No.
No,
It's,
I can see myself. So can you see me now?
No.
Can you see me now?
No.
Lucas, your image is frozen, but a moment ago, your slides were on the screen.
Okay. So let me, okay. So I've got the slides back. Okay. Can you see me again now?
We can see the slide. I don't
So
see you.
I take it that okay, I'm not sure what I can do about that. I guess I'll just go on with you not being able to see me. So I take it that Mark and Ruth Milligan offer just different accounts of function. And I take it that both of these notions of function are perfectly good. And we can basically have a pluralist account of representations. One way of understanding the normativity of functions is going to be in Mark's terms. We've got another notion of function in terms of design or selection. That's another perfectly good notion of function for certain types of explanatory purposes. So I want to suggest that we can accept both Mark's account of function and hence Mark's account of representation and these etiological accounts of function and representation. Now, I guess there's two ways to be a pluralist. One could be a pluralist along the lines of thinking that you've got things to be explained, and we can explain one set of things in terms of Mark's notion and another set of things in terms of Milligan's notion. So for example, maps you might think are best explained in design terms, the representational content, whereas things like worms, insofar as they have representations, maybe Mark's account may be better. So one way to be a pluralist may be to suggest that there are two different domains. But I think that we can be a pluralist and think that we can use both types of representations to explain different aspects of the same thing. So I'm going to defend a sort of view of pluralism that says Mark's types of explanations and Milligan's types of explanations can be used to explain the same sort of target behavior and capture different aspects of that sort of behavior. So Milligan, in a recent paper we looked at in the reading group, basically says representations can be correct or incorrect, true or false, fulfilled or unfulfilled, satisfied or unsatisfied. And so representations have a normative character, and the normative status of a representation depends upon whether or not it is doing what it is supposed to do. And then she gives this quote from her earlier book, and she comments, this is all there is to the claim that was later dubbed as teleosemantics. And I take it understood in these very broad terms, the idea that representations have a normative status and we're supposed to cash out their normative status in functional terms. I take it that this is something that is common between her view and Mark's view. Now, Milligan then suggests in this paper that there are three questions the proponent of teleosemantics needs to answer. The first is, what is it to have a function in the appropriate sense? The second is, what is the specific function of a representation as such? The function required for it to be a representation, what is its job? And what is the particular method, if any, by which a good, undamaged representation performs its function? Now, I take it the fundamental distinction between Mark and Ruth has got to do with how they answer the first question. Hold on, do you think maybe you could turn off your connection because it's messing with the... Yeah, why don't you do that? Sorry, my wife is also listening to it, and my my connection has been fine all day, but now Zubayd is on there. There seems to be a problem with my connection. Okay, so I take it the fundamental difference between Milligan's position and Marx's position, their account of representations, has got to do with their answer to question 1. Milligan, like most contemporary defenders of teleosemantics, offers an etiological account of what it is to be a function, with the function of a thing being what it has been designed for or selected for. Picard, in contrast, takes the fundamental notion of a process serving a function to be one of contributing to the stability of the far from thermodynamic equilibrium process of which it is a part. And so, according to Marx's account, this notion of serving a function is not dependent or upon the past history of the system, but it depends purely upon its current and future dynamics. So Milligan and Picard offer different accounts of what a function is. I'm going to skip the answer to the second question, but I take it that here I think there's some agreement, because Milligan suggests that something counts as a representation only if it is used as a representation. And she argues that there's a necessity of some sort of interpreter or a consumer that is able to use the representation appropriately. And I take it Marx basically is committed to a kind of dynamic version of something like this second commitment. Okay, so I'm going to now look at Marx's account. I guess for some of you, many of you, you'll already know this. I want to run through it, partly just to make sure myself that I've got a proper understanding of Marx's position. So Mark, if I get anything wrong, I hope you'll let me know. So Marc Picard's interactivist model of representation is based upon the idea that living beings are far from thermodynamic equilibrium, recursively self-maintaining systems. And we can call any such system an autonomous system. And this provides us with an understanding of biological normativity in any independent of any considerations having to do with evolutionary history or selection. For with any such system, we have a basic notion of serving a function in terms of contributing to the stability and hence the continued existence of the system. Yeah. And Marx himself is committed to a sort of process metaphysics all the way down. But I think that even if one doesn't buy into a view that is committed to processes all the way down, we can have very good reasons to think that living beings should be thought of in process terms in the way that Picard advocates. And I think in terms of this marketing thing, I think in terms of marketing, that many people are attracted to these process understandings of biology who aren't necessarily attracted to process metaphysics all the way down. And I think you could kind of win some of these people over without necessarily getting them to buy into the whole process metaphysics all the way down. I think of course your whole system works on this, but I think the stuff you want to say about representation and biological normativity could be the sort of stuff you could sell to someone who just wants to remain uncommittal about metaphysics. Yeah, so as a Kantian, I'm quite suspicious of metaphysics in general. And so I quite like a sort of methodological process metaphysics as process explanations is good. I think starting off with the metaphysics may be a way of pushing people away rather than attracting them. So I think starting off with the claim, well, everyone agrees, or almost many people agree, that biological systems are best understood in these process terms is a good selling point. So Picard's canonical example of a far from thermodynamic equilibrium self-maintaining process, the candle flame. So a flame, amongst other things, induces convection, which sucks in a fresh supply of oxygen and removes waste. It melts wax in the candle, which can then serve as fuel to keep the flame going. And with a suitable supply of oxygen and wax, the flame will maintain itself through these processes and continue its existence. Yep. what distinguishes living systems from candle flame is that living systems are not just tenant, but they're recursive tenant. They make their self-maintenance. So such systems are able to maintain their self-maintenance as the local environment changes by modifying their activities. So Bicard's canonical example of a recursively self-maintaining system is a bacterium that swims so long as it is heading up a sugar gradient, but tumbles if it is heading down such a gradient. Quote, swimming up a sugar gradient contributes to its self-maintenance, but swimming down a sugar gradient does not. The bacterium can differentiate, detect the two conditions, and select swimming or tumbling accordingly. Now, this then allows him to offer an account, this basic dynamic framework allows to offer an account of serving and having a function. So a process serves a function in an autonomous system insofar as it contributes to the maintenance of the system of which it's a part. And so this also plays a part in maintaining itself. A part of an autonomous system has its functionally presuppose other processes in order for these other processes to serve their function. So we can give a concrete example of this. Your heart helps keep you alive by pumping blood around your body, and in so doing, it helps maintain the conditions for its own continued existence. But in order for the heart to serve this function,
excuse me.
the lung, yeah?
Please turn off your camera. Your audio is breaking up a whole lot. Try turning off your camera.
Could you just turn off your Wi-Fi? I think I haven't had any problem all day, and I think Zubaydah has just turned on her connection, so I guess she can. Yeah, I guess having both of our Wi-Fi doesn't support both of us. Hold on. Okay, so I'm going to stop my video. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, and Zubaydah, did you? Okay, so I'm now, we're at the minimum we can be at with So Mark basically starts off with the notion of something serving a function in dynamic terms of the notion of some sort of functional presupposition.
Hi, I'm sorry, this is Ruth Milliken. I'm being blasted by, it might be that your mouth should be not quite so close to the mic.
Okay.
But I'm having a very hard time understanding because it's just blasting, you know, it's like a trumpet. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear, is that better now?
That's better, yes, thank you.
Yeah? What? I think this is okay now. Okay. So I'm gonna try speaking more quietly. Could someone give me a thumbs up and let me know if this is now working? Okay. So your heart keeps you alive by pumping blood around your body. By doing it, maintain the conditions for its own continued existence. In order for the heart to serve this function, the lung will be bringing oxygen into the blood and removing excess carbon dioxide. The lungs then have the function of bringing fresh oxygen into the blood because it's a functional presupposition of the rest of the system. Okay. So I take it that this account of having and serving a function then allows, Mark to offer a non-etiological account of supposition, underlies the interactivist account of representational content. For certain processes, don't just functionally presuppose other processes taking place within the organism, but also presuppose that the world is in a certain way. So the process of walking, for example, functionally presupposes that the ground carries on ahead of me. And so this allows the interactivist to provide an account of what Picard calls minimal representing. So living autonomous systems need to continuously interact with their environments to survive. And Picard explains, and now I'm going to quote, engaging in such interactions is functionally anticipatory that they will in fact succeed in contributing to the maintenance of the autonomous system. That is, the success or lack thereof, and the conditions upon which that might depend, are in the future of the interaction once initiated. As such, there is an implicit prediction that this is one of those environments in which the initiated interaction will proceed as anticipated. That prediction, therefore, might itself be true or false. The environment might or might not be among the supportive kinds. Under some conditions, the activity will be functional, while under others, it will not. Initiating the activity, therefore, presupposes that those supportive conditions hold. So this is the kind of fundamental, basic idea of representation. And then on the basis of this account, Picard builds up more complex representations in terms of what he calls webs of interactive potentialities. And he offers basically a Piaget-inspired account of how representations, say, of small manipulatable objects can emerge. So I'm going to skip this because I guess people have already heard this. Now, one of the things that I think that his model offers a plausible account of a certain type of representation, which can function within certain types of explanation. And the implicit presuppositions of anticipatory processes allow for organism detectable error, which allows for a plausible and needed account of learning. But the organism recognizes that the presuppositions has not been met when the anticipations are not fulfilled. And Picard argues that the possibility of accounting for system detectable error, representational error, is a central desideratum of any theory of representation. Yeah, so here's a quote, I'm not going to read it. And he thinks that etiological theories of representation like Milligan's cannot account for system detectable error. And so he says, no organism can take into account the evolutionary or learning history of its functional representations, or the asymmetric dependencies among potential invocations of its representations to be able to determine what its representations are supposed to represent. Nor can they then compare that normative content with what is currently being represented to find out if the representation is being truly applied or forcefully applied. To accomplish the latter is the problem of representation over again. Now, I'm going to return to this claim later because I think that externalist theories of representation just don't think this is to be, don't take this to be a central desideratum. And I think that the way in which they play the role in some types of explanation, they can play this role perfectly well without presupposing very strong terms. So I think that there's no reason in principle why we cannot add etiologically specified representations on top of an interactivist framework. Now, I take it that because the framework is dynamic, I guess the vehicles of such content could be, as Shia in his book suggests, be, say, particular dynamic parameters such as frequency, phase, impedance, and gain. And we could even think of kind of something analogous to algorithmic operations on such vehicles in terms of certain types of dependency relation between such parameters. And then we could offer historical accounts, either in terms of learning or evolution, as to how such parameters have the function of representing certain environmental features. And I think that such explanations would not be used to explain a particular dynamic flow. This isn't their role. But I think appealing to such representations and such processes can and should be used to explain certain regularities and patterns of activity. And so, for example, how the organism is robustly able to succeed in certain tasks, how the organism fails in systematic ways in others. I also think that singular content, and this is going to be the final thing I'm going to look at. So why not both? What rules out having the interactivist position, and then on top of that, once you've got all these dynamics, saying then we can take certain dynamic parameters, and we might have good reasons to think of some of these in representational terms. And I think there might be another question, why not both? And I'm going to suggest there might be reasons why we need both. So I take it that there are going to be, I'm going to look at 4 different problems where I think the interaction, or where there's some problem. So I think that firstly, the interactivist model does not provide an intuitive account of what I call Magoo cases. Secondly, the model does not allow us to distinguish between failure due to misrepresentation and failure due to bad technique, which I think is an important distinction. Thirdly, it's not clear how the interactivist explains what's being represented when we represent or misrepresent a predator and escape from it. Yeah, so I call this the problem of cats and cucumbers, and this should become clear as we get closer. And finally, Bicard representations, I take it, are essentially descriptivist. They're essentially, or they're a pragmatist version of a sort of descriptivist position. And so I take it his count isn't able to offer any account of a singular, essentially object involving content. And I think we have good reasons to posit such content. So these are the 4 problems. I wonder how Mark will respond to each of these. So Magoo cases. So one thing about Bicard's account is that he recognizes his account of content only provides us with partitions of environment types. So he says the structure of possible outcomes of a differentiating interaction imposes a partition of the differentiation outcome classes on possible environments. Such partitionings replace standard conceptions of epistemology as based on correspondences, generating a partition epistemology. But not only are the partitions not necessarily unique to individual entities or to entities at all. So I think the criticisms I'm going to make turn out, I think Mark's response will be these are bugs. These are sort of features of the interactivist model. And I don't want to suggest that these, I think Mark gives us a perfectly good notion of representation that's able to explain a whole bunch of stuff, and it's able to explain how organisms emerge in an important way. But I think there are certain things that this notion of representation can't account for, but we've got perfectly good alternative notions of representation that we can use in certain types of explanation to explain these things. So here's Mr. Magoo. He's a famous okay, so oops. So this is Mr. Magoo. Mr. Magoo is a character introduced in 1949, famous cartoon character. He's short-sighted, and he kind of wanders through the world, constantly, I would say, misrepresenting his environment, but getting lucky. So I don't see how Bicard has the resources to explain the possibility of misrepresentation combined with good luck, which allows for one's action to proceed as anticipated. Now, of course, I think Picard can offer an account of how Magoo, what Magoo's short-sightedness amounted to, because he has limited situation knowledge. And I think this is going to capture something about his short-sightedness. But I think he's going to have to say that when the banjo falls in front of him to provide a bridge, Magoo has correctly represented his environment because the anticipations have gone on as expected. So Magoo, thinking there's a road in front of him, has correctly represented his environment. The second type of problem, I think, and we can think of a sort of converse case to Magoo cases, where we think that an organism has correctly represented the environment, but has been unlucky in their actions. And I take it, once again, an explanation appealing to Picard representations will not allow us to make a distinction that it might be useful to make, whereas an explanation in terms of Milligan representations will allow us to make such an explanation. So let's take a frog. Let's suppose that the frog has evolved such that in certain types of environment in which there are flies, a certain neuron fires, and this causes its tongue to flick, which sometimes leads to the frog catching and eating a fly. Now, let's assume that this tongue flicking is extremely inaccurate and the frog only rarely catches a fly. We can distinguish between three cases. There's a fourth case I won't discuss now. So flies are present, the neuron fires. Oops, am I still, can you still hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay, yeah, sorry, okay. So we have one case where flies are present, the neuron fires, and anticipatory tongue flicking ensues, and the frog catches and eating a fly. But we have a second case where the flies are present, the neuron fires, and anticipatory tongue flicking ensues, and the frog does not catch and eat a fly. Bad luck. And finally, we have a case where flies are not present, but the neuron fires, the anticipatory tongue flicking ensues, and the frog does not catch and eat a fly. Now, take it that according to Picard's way of understanding what's going on, every case apart from the first case are going to be cases of misrepresentation. Now, so because insofar as the anticipation is unsuccessful, then what we've got is we've got lack of success, therefore the anticipation, the presuppositions are falsified. And I think we've got good reasons to think that from the outside, so I take it if we do make this distinction between misrepresentation and bad technique, you may end up with a notion of representation where you don't have organism detectable error. But it seems that from the outside, we may have lots of cases where we want to apply this distinction. So think of the kind of teenage boy who asks a girl out, and he reads on, I don't know, he's on some website, and he reads that his problem of his lack of technique. All he really needs to do is he needs to improve his techniques. So every time he fails, he goes home and becomes more obnoxious. He practices his technique in front of a mirror and goes out and tries again. Now, looking at such a situation from the outside, it might be clear that his failure is due to misrepresentation. Now, the problem isn't lack of technique; it's a false representation. He's misunderstood what's going on. But from his first person perspective, he can't really know if he's in a type 3 situation rather than a type 2 situation. From the first person perspective, he knows something has gone wrong, but he does not know what. So I take it the sort of explanation we give in this case, in which we make a distinction between misrepresentation and bad technique, and say that his problem isn't bad technique, it's misrepresentation. I take it this form of explanation is perfectly a good form of explanation, I think. And it's one that once you engage in this type of explanation, you don't posit the possibility of organism detectable representational error. And I take it that
Lucas, last 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Yeah.
and I take it we've got something similar with the frog and the iPhone. So we've got this frog, it's looking at an iPhone. This is a kind of a video of a type 3 situation where the frog is constantly flicking. And I take it in such a case, a plausible explanation of what's going on in the frog is that the frog is misrepresenting its environment. And if the frog normally only succeeds in catching an ant every 100 tongue flicks, the fact that it flicks at the screen and does not eat does not indicate that it's in a type 3 situation rather than a type 2 situation. Yep. The fact that the frog does not catch an ant on any particular tongue flick does not indicate that she has misrepresented the presence of ants, because even in an ant-rich environment, most tongue flicks are unsuccessful. Now, of course, if the frog flicks for many hours and catches nothing, it's likely to move to a different location. So the frog may have a certain behavioral sensitivity to errors of misrepresentation, which allows it to modify its behavior in an adaptive way by changing its location. But I take it such sensitivity to failure is not really organism detectable representational error in the way that Mark wants. I take it, we've also got the problem of catastrophic events. So we've got this situation type 4, where the flies are present, the neuron fires, and just before it manages to eat, it's hit over the head. And once again, I take it on of misrepresentation. Okay, the third sort of worry I've got is how Mark explains the way in which organisms react to predators. Yeah, and sort of one sort of example we might think are cats and cucumbers. Can you see the video?
Yes.
Yeah, you know, cats, when they see cucumbers, they completely freak out. Oops. Oops. Yeah, you can spend hours. I can spend hours watching cats and cucumbers. Now, I think the problem I'm pointing to here is that suppose a gazelle spots a lion and runs. What does it anticipate? Does it anticipate? And I think that on the interactivist account, the interactivist faces a dilemma here. Yeah, insofar as the gazelle anticipates running, this anticipation is successful whether or not there is a lion present in the environment. So the gazelle who spots a lion and runs, and a gazelle who's spooked by a shadow and runs, both successfully represent the environment because both environments allow for running away. And insofar as the gazelle successfully runs away, its anticipations are realized. So if we think, yep, but if we take it that the gazelle anticipates being clawed, then the gazelle who spots a lion and escapes untouched fails to represent the environment correctly. But the gazelle who gets clawed is the only one who correctly represents the environment. So I'm just wondering how this account of representations in terms of successful anticipations of possibility of actions allows one to correctly represent a threat that one succeeds in escaping from. Yeah, so I think I'm not sure. And it seems to me that the sort of Milligan type explanations offer perfectly good accounts of the way in which a certain, you know, that it looks like the cat, for example, is misrepresenting the cucumber as something like a threat, as possibly something like a snake. And they've evolved to be afraid of snakes. And this is what the reaction is. So I think in terms of the, this story, it seems to me that the Milligan type explanation works perfectly well. Finally, it seems to me that Mark's position is basically a sort of pragmatist version of descriptivism. And as such, it can't really account for singular content. And it seems to me that there are good reasons why one might want to appeal to singular content in certain types of explanations. So I take it like Mark's position is a sort of an active interactivist. There's a sort of internalist side, something like narrow content. Yeah, and that's all fine and good. But you can have another form of explanation that is going to be in terms of something like broad content. Yeah, it's going to be an externalist account. And both of these forms of description of explanation seem to be perfectly good types of explanations, but have different types of explanatory roles. So descriptivism, this is a quote from Recanati, is the view that our mental relations to individual objects go through properties of those objects. What are given to us are first and foremost properties whose worldly instantiation we are able to detect, and only indirectly objects. That is so because according to the view, our knowledge of objects is mediated by our knowledge of their property. And according to such a position, we get at physical objects only by a semantic shot in the dark. We specify properties or relations and hope that they are uniquely exemplified. Now, I take it Picard, because of his representations are kind of action-oriented, is not a descriptivist in the way some philosophers are, who try and cash out descriptive content in terms of sensory primitives. But I take it he should be thought of, I think, as a sort of pragmatist analog of a descriptivist. The infant learns to recognize the red sphere by learning how it can be interacted with. But anything that can be interacted with in the same way will be counted as that again. So I take it that the interactivist account of object representation is an action-based analog of the satisfactional account of reference determination. We represent an object in terms of a web of action possibilities, and wherever we can interact with it in the same way, that's what's represented. We have the kind of the representation of something that can be interacted with in that way. And I think we I think this is a perfectly good account of representational content, but I also think we need an account of singular content. And I think we can do this perfectly well with a sort of externalist notion of content. One I like is Milligan's accounts of substance concepts. For reasons of time, I won't go into it. I take it that in order to possess a kind of concept of an individual, one must have a fairly reliable capacity to re-identify the object in question. But this capacity of re-identification does not fix the reference of the content. Yeah? Rather, the extension of the concept is determined by the function of the concept, and then the function of the concept then is explained in etiological terms. If we think of such concepts as files, as people like Recanati do, then we can think that the file has the function of collecting information about a particular thing, and it is that that determines the reference. So the function of my representation of Zubeide is to collect useful information about Zubeide, so I know how to interact with her the next time I meet her. Now, how am I for time?
Well, like 1 or 2 minutes or 45 minutes. Okay,
so Mark criticizes Milligan for having an epiphenomenalism. There are times when she seems to suggest, like in her recent paper, that this is a passage Dan mentioned, that these representations are supposed to play a causal role. I take it, though, this isn't her considered view. And so in her 2020 paper, she offers this account. I won't read it because I'm running out of time. I think Shea offers an analogous view. So he makes a distinction between process explanations and program explanations, and thinks that the sort of explanations he's offering in terms of etiological notions of the functions involved in representations are best thought of as program representations rather than process explanations. And I take it this sort of explanation is analogous, I take it, to the one that Milligan offers. And I take it that if you're going to have a conception of representations that involve some etiological notion of function, this is basically the way to go. Something along these lines is going to work. And I think the problem with our representation of individuals, I've got my final 2 slides and then I'll stop, is it's clear that there's not a single mechanism involved in our capacity to keep track of individuals over time, even in the simple case of perceptual tracking of an individual. So instead, we keep track of individuals by using a complex set of quite distinct processes. And the only way of picking out or naming this set of processes, I think, of individuating this set, is in terms of the individual that they are involved in tracking. I think just looking inside the organism, there's no way of telling that these distinct processes and mechanisms are all involved in the exercise of a particular capacity to keep track of a particular individual. So the unity of these processes can only be understood by looking outside the organism and understanding what they are for and what individual they are attempting to track. So I may be looking at my wife when there's a power cut and our apartment is plunged into darkness, something that happens quite commonly here in Kutulush. I hear her walking and she calls out. I reach out and find her hand. So here I begin by tracking her visually. This visual tracking shifts to an auditory tracking until we finally make tactile contact. What unifies the processes across distinct modalities is the fact that it's Zubaydah I'm tracking. Yeah, there's no single mechanism or process involved in this continual process of tracking. But it is my wife that I'm going to keep track of. If I reach out and grab the hand of another woman in the dark, I've made a mistake, a big mistake. And so the best we can do here is something like offering a definite description of an open-ended set of mechanisms or processes that have the same function, keeping track of Zubaydah. That was supposed to be appealing to the sort of explanation that Milligan gave in her 2020 paper that I couldn't read. Okay, sorry I went on for longer than I intended.
Thank you, Lucas.
Oops.
All right, any questions, comments?
Okay, Heather.
Ken, go ahead.
Thank you. And Lucas, thank you for letting me read your paper in advance, which was of help. I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
Comment concerns system detectable error, semantic externalism. And I think you're likely right that current representatives of semantic externalism don't worry much about system detectable error or anything like that. I'm a lot less persuaded that they're justified in ignoring the phenomenon, and that they are, as so often with encodingism, likely guilty of assuming what they really ought to at least examine. Now, what I want to say about that view is that part of what I've learned thinking through and listening to Mark about his views is that this is a further reason why Hegel's solution to the Brownian dilemma of the criterion is so important, because it does account for system detectable error at a very high level conceptualization, in part with a mixed internalist, externalist account of content, and definitely externalism about reference, justification, mental content. So thank you, Mark, for that.
Okay.
So I want to complain about your rather lightly accepting their neglect of this issue as evidence that they don't need to account for it. 'Cause I don't think that's at all right. The other little question, the videos of the cats were amusing in a way, but I want to ask, why didn't you find a cucumber that flicks its tongue and see what the cats do with that?
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I tried the cucumber tongue flicking, but no luck, Ken. Not even on Google. I couldn't find it. Yeah, no, I sort of agree with you. Like in the paper, when I talk about the teenage boy case, I add a little. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but I do then say, well, in some sense, there's no system detectable error. Unless one kind of, at some point, you may think he can kind of inference to best explanation that the problem isn't the technique, the problem is that she's not interested. So I take it that if you allow for sort of reflective capacities, this may then give you some way of being an externalist, but allowing for system detectable or system detectable improvements. So one system of reference. So yeah.
All right.
Can you?
So in the case of this young kid, you've got a new category of system reprehensible error.
Yeah, but yeah. So I agree with you that the externalist isn't in as bad a place as I may have suggested when it comes to system detectable error, if you allow for inference to the best explanation, which I take it is how science works. And so through advances in science, our concepts maybe slowly improve. And so if we allow inference to best explanation, I think this gives us some way of improving our sort of externalist type of representations.
I'm sorry,
This is
that's
Ruth.
just more
This is
bad
Ruth.
empiricism.
Excuse me, my hand raising
Oh,
thing doesn't work. So I just wanted
Oh.
to let you know that eventually I would like to speak, even though I can't raise my hand.
okay. Who's chairing it? Oh,
Okay, Georgi.
Isn't that Mark first, or you see the order? I don't know.
Yeah, I see the order.
Anyways.
It is you.
Okay. Anyway, so yeah, I think the comment I have sort of was covered slightly
Oh,
by
I
Ken's
found
remark. Yeah, I don't think it's a fair description as a counterexample that here you have an error which is not detectable from the point of view of the system, like in the boys the boy trying to pick up the lady there, and so that does not sort of falsify the statement in interactivism that which allows this type of approach allows for system detectable errors as opposed to encodingism, which does not. And then you obviously here, I can just ask you, because for the frog, you said after a while, the frog will eventually probably change the environment. Well, probably the boy would do the same. He will realize, well, this doesn't work. Either I change the location or I change the approach. So that you may consider this as external effect on boys' behavior. but it has so much to do with enculturization, maybe, if that's a word, and the education, the background, and so on and so on. I don't think it's in my opinion, it's a valid objection to interactivism.
Yeah. So this discussion, in some sense, I wasn't making an objection to interactivism. So Mark has a complaint against people like Milligan that they can't, with the notion of representation they can't account for system detectable errors. And I take it that, so I take it that the two options, and I think there's something right about that on Mark's account, system detectable error is very easy to account for because it's just, but it turns out that the contents of representation are not very specific, And if you want to have representations with these specific contents, if you have representations like that, you're not going to have a simple type of system detectable error. But I think, as I said in reply to Ken, I think first of all, you've got something like inference to best explanation, which may at some point lead you to to change your representations. And in the case of the frog, that the frog might be built in such a way that if it gets hungry, it increases its exploratory activity. And so if it's in a fly poor environment and it's flicking and it's getting hungry, it may move to somewhere else. And I take it that's not going to be, that's not going to be system detectable error, I would say, but it's a way in which the frog can get its representations understood in these etiological terms more correct. That if you're being unsuccessful and you move, this is a way of one way of probably increasing the likelihood of success.
Which is the strategy that Boy can apply equally. Yes.
This stuff about system detectable error, this wasn't a criticism of Mark's position. Mark's making a criticism of other people, and he's saying that they haven't got the capacity for system detectable error. And that's what I was discussing.
Okay, I was just making more general, not necessarily tied to Millikan's approach, but in more general way to encoding or symbol-based systems and their incapacity for system detectable error. I was just making that distinction. So if it makes sense.
Right. So, could I speak, Ruth Milligan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. I wish I had this paper in advance too.
Yeah.
But I would say just one or two things. I think one main difference between, well, first of all, let me say this almost as though Mark and I were talking about different things, both of which are there, as it were. I mean, and of course, this is a problem the philosophers have all the time, and that is they're simply fighting over words. It's really not helping much. But let me mention something about the description of representation that I've given that I think is for me is absolutely central, but seems to be totally missing from Mark's position. He wants to avoid something he calls encoding, and I'm not sure what encoding is. But what I do think we have to maintain if we're talking about representation is that whenever you have a representation, it's just one thing that could be said in a representational system. It always has to be a system where other things could have been represented instead. I think that's fundamental to representation. And I've argued that that's even so where the quote representation is merely a beaver splash at a time, but you've got a variable, you've got a time and a place, they're variables, you've got a system, right? So there's no such thing as representation without system. And what that means is that there's always some kind of isomorphism or homomorphism probably between the domain of things that could be represented and the domain of possible representations. But there's an isomorphism here. And that's why representations can be, I mean, a representation is read by something. There's no point in making representations unless something uses them. I mean, this is my kind of representation. What would be the point of making representations if nobody used them, if nothing used them? So they have to be made in a system that can be read, that is determined ahead of time to be readable by some other group or individual or part of the system who understands the language, as it were. So who has been, and that whole part of the notion of representation that I've been jumping up and down again, I do feel needs to be talked about, whether you want to call it a representation or not. It's absolutely essential when we're talking about language, when we're talking about, I think, perception, no sort of question. And undoubtedly other kinds of mental representation, whatever. I don't know what encoding is, but I have no interest particularly in calculations, et cetera. That's not what I'm arguing for. But just that, for heaven's sake, a representation is in a system of representations, and it's got structure.
Absolutely. And just a brief comment. I mean, there are thousands of systems of representation. We use them all the time. Language to begin with. You have numerical notations, different type of representation of numbers. You have all sorts of representations which are built upon other. But here we're talking about the representation from the biological point of view, from a very low level of where do you get the epistemic contact and content from. So that is the type of representation I believe is crucial to be discussed. We're not talking about, and this was the big error of in the beginnings with AI, where people just took that, let's say, the symbolic logic representation and just said, well, these are the symbols, and then we have to find a way how to connect this with the sensors, and that's it.
Well, that kind of representation is the very last thing that I would have talked about.
Can I? Yeah, but like, so I'm not sure how Mark would answer this. So let me try and say two things. That I'm not sure what he'll say is that there's no such thing as representation without a system. So I'd like to hear how Mark would reply to that. You said that in order for there to be representation, there needs to be a domain of things that can be represented. And there, I think Mark maybe isn't going to accept that because he doesn't believe in things. He believes in processes. And his account of this sort of basic representational content isn't in terms of things being represented, but in terms of partitions. Yeah, so you get these basic partitions. And so I think this is a kind of maybe fundamental difference where you've got one account of representations where you've got a domain of things to be represented. And then you've got the idea of representations as sort of making partitions into kind of, you partition the environment into two. That's basically the fundamental notion.
Why are these not compatible? I mean, the argument was that these are compatible.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask Mark whether he thinks they're compatible. So
I'm not sure that I think they're compatible, but that was the argument.
Yeah. So I take it though you've got an account of what biological systems are like, and then you've got a way of thinking about these systems in terms of thinking of representations as indications of potential action. So you've got this forward-oriented notion. But once you've got these dynamic systems, you're going to have certain parameters that may have been selected for by evolution or through learning to correlate with certain things in the environment. So I take it that given the underlying ontology of processes, you're going to have things that could be identified as representations in your terms, I think. Things that have been selected for that play some role in how the dynamics unfold. That's why I think they're compatible. But I think the basic notion of representation, I think Mark's notion of representation doesn't presuppose a domain of things that can be represented. But maybe, I mean, Mark's here, so why don't we let him tell us, yeah, what he thinks.
Yeah, Mark, do you wanna go ahead?
Okay, all of these, I have a whole page of these now again, and it's a dense page. And I've been trying to figure out what seems to me to be common themes in the issues that I would like to respond to. It seems to me that all of the questions and challenges are legitimate. I don't necessarily have the same response to all of them, but I'll attempt to dig underneath some of these issues. One of my inferences to the best explanation for why I would question some of the issues that Lucas was making have to do with his reliance on some version or another of externalism. And you use that word. I would re-emphasize, I certainly do not reject the existence of external representations. Morse code, you know, the neutrino count in the gold mine, those all represent, and they are external representations. The usage of external representations as a model, however, gives you problems when you try to account for representation itself. So you've got, for example, activity in some column in the visual cortex in V1 in the brain that is supposed to represent a boundary at a certain angle. And to oversimplify, let's say it only fires when a boundary with that angle shows up in the visual field. Well, fine, that's a representation, all right, for boundary at that angle for the neuropsychologist, not for the animal. It may be a detection for the animal, but the animal doesn't represent that. What the animal does, to use Ruth's language, is use it.
That's natural information, and it would be on my view.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's information. Differentiation gives you information. Gives you information. But from the external perspective, insofar as the biologist is in a position to detect that activity and know the relationship, notice that's exactly parallel. To be able to detect the neutrinos and know the relationship between the neutrinos and the fusion processes in the sun, the biologist can, in those conditions, make use of that as a quote representation, unquote, of boundary at a particular angle. So part of my sense of what's going on here is that externalism, I think, is an illegitimate application of the fact that we have external representations. It's an attempt to take what's true about external representations and use them as a model of what's going on inside. Okay, that's one very general comment that applies to some of these other things, and in other cases it doesn't. Some of your points turn on probabilistic issues, like what if it only works to flick your tongue to eat in some low probability of times? Yeah. The whole framework requires further elaboration and sophistication to handle these probabilistic things. But I've already introduced in our book discussion group the notion of themes, which is one of the things that does that. Themes do a lot more than that, but themes, as I've tried to define them, give us that. Some of your other issues have to, well, this is a little more confusing, but anyway, you stayed, I think, pretty consistent with the idea of anticipation of flow, but occasionally some of the things you said sounded like the failures were due to anticipation of goal. And those are related, but they're not identical. You can have failure or success of anticipation of flow with either failure or success of anticipation with goal. So that they are not internally related to each other. Another involved emotion reactions, and that of course gets us into a whole lot more stuff. Another characteristic, and this may or may not be connected to the externalism, or it may be independent and supportive of it, is your focus on singular representation of singular entities and objects and so on. And on the one hand, I would agree with you that this model is not built with that as a foundation. On the other hand, I would suggest and claim that it can account for that. That singular representation is in effect representation of a unit set and an indication, a presupposition that it is a unit set and of what kind of a unit set it is. So issues, as you were pointing out, issues of individuation, issues of re-identification, ship of Theseus, which one is the original, if either, all this kind of stuff. Those are additional criteria for a differentiation. If I invoke those criteria, like by using the word the or whatever, or by saying the with a noun that carries with it notions of particular kinds of individuation or re-identification, then I've said, okay, it's a unit set differentiation. I can incidentally be wrong about that, but I've made the claim that it's a unit set differentiation, and I've made the claim about what kind of a unit set it is, and I've made the claim about what sorts of principles indirectly of individuation and re-identification would apply. Notice that these issues of individuation and re-identification are anticipatory. So I may not engage in actually checking the individuations and the re-identifications, but in effect, I'm anticipating that if I were to, it would turn out a certain way. And so what I claim I'm doing when I make singular representations to you is I'm claiming that if you were to engage in those processes of checking the re-identification and individuation, you would get certain results. An example I often give here to sort of illustrate this, but it illustrates a point that's made in the philosophical literature much more sophisticatedly, is Piaget's daughter that he was taking a walk with, and they saw a slug on the path. And a little while later, they see a slug. And she says something like, oh, there it is again. Well, in some general type sense, I suppose she was right, but in a token sense, she was wrong. But you can't always tell. She hadn't learned all of the principles of identification and re-identification and individuation and so on. And that's another point here. They have to be learned. And not all animals have all of the sophisticated ones that we have. And in fact, science gives us more all the time. Okay. You talked about partitions. Partitions are what are produced by differentiations. But any given any different given participation, I don't want to say that, any given partition, any given differentiation is in fact a differentiation of something out there. Some current state of affairs or current state of process would probably be a better way to say it. It may or may not involve an individual. It may or may not involve something that's re-identifiable. It may or may not involve something that has boundaries, on and on and on. If I think it does, and if it's relevant to me, I will try to indicate that I think it does and that I claim that it does. But partitions don't give us truth. A differentiation process arrives at some differentiating outcome, and that's contact. You still need content. You still need the anticipations in order to have representational content, or at least that's what I claim. Now, notice with respect to Ruth's claim, which I completely agree with, a differentiation is not a differentiation if there's only one possible differentiation outcome. In order for a differentiation to have any status function as a differentiation, any contact function, it has to have more than one possible outcome. So it has to be part of a system. So in the simplest conceivable case, it has only two possible outcomes. And I often talk about it that way. But I point out several times that, well, you know, it could have 3 possible outcomes, or it could have 7, or it could have 107. They could form a nominal list. They could form a continuum. They could form a lattice. They could have all kinds of organizational properties as a system. And so I would simply want to reinforce Ruth's point there.
Okay, so you could have a system of differentiation. So one thing I've been thinking about is how you would explain, you know, recent work on place cells, for example, within your framework,
Right.
and the way in which this system of place cells can kind of, I think the cognitive science say, oh, this represents the rat's local environment, or is used to do that. But then you'd sort of say that what you've got there is a system of differentiations.
Yes,
That-
exactly.
Okay.
It's exactly parallel in that respect to the boundary angle detector in the cortex.
Okay.
And I'm assuming Ruth would actually agree with me that the mere fact, quote unquote, that it correlates with place in some sense, although that turns out to be a lot more complicated than just place detector, is not enough. It has to be, to use Ruth's language, not mine, it has to be consumed in some sense.
That's be
my-
used that way.
Yeah.
in my way of talking about it, it has to serve as the invoker of the microgenetic setup of anticipations of further possibilities. So anticipations of further possibilities that I may or may not pursue. I mean, I may or may not be doing something or wanting to be doing something for which that quote place detector is a relevant kind of contact. But it's, you know, it still serves as a contact, and I will,
Yeah.
in general, apperceptively set up a bunch of anticipations based on it.
Yeah, so that's where I may have misread you then. So I was thinking that your differentiations were just purely in terms of partitions. But if you're allowing for systems of differentiations, yeah, so that you've got
Well,
some structure
it's
there.
systems of
I'm just
differentiation
wondering.
outcomes. It's systems of differentiation outcomes, but you get the truth in, just like with axioms and implicit definition, you get the truth value, and therefore what I'm emphasizing for representation, not in the differentiation, not in the partition system either, but in the relationships among them. If I engage in this differentiation and I reach this outcome, then this further sort of interaction will, I anticipate, go with the flow that's being set up for. I also have a response to several of other of your possibilities. One of them is the Magoo example,
Yeah.
which is a very interesting challenge. But notice everything in this is implicit. The implicit differentiations, the implicit presuppositions are implicit. So yes, I would agree that Magoo has successfully indicated the possibility of walking and maintaining supported. But just like failures are not self-diagnostic about what is it that failed, successes are also not self-diagnostic about what is it that succeeded. That takes further analysis if the creature is capable of it, if the creature cares. Magoo probably doesn't care, given the Magoo character. But, you know, we as an external observer, and here comes externalism again, says, oh, well, did Magoo really have it right? Because we assume that Magoo is not just indicating a potentiality for successful walking, but that Magoo was indicating some sort of a solid, already there support. Well, Magoo doesn't have to resume that in order for Magoo to have success in walking. That's our diagnosis. And we assume Magoo had a different, more specific representation there, and therefore Magoo succeeded in his interaction even though his representation was false. I'm claiming, no, Magoo's representation at the level of interactive indication was true. He just, if he were to think about it at all, would probably have a completely wrong diagnosis of how it turned out to be true. Just like if he fell, he'd probably have a wrong diagnosis of how he turned out to be wrong. So error assignment is a real serious problem, and success assignment is a real serious problem. It's discussed later in the book. We haven't reached there yet, I don't think. But error assignment and success assignment is not the same as detecting error or detecting success.
Mark, can I ask?
Sure.
You know, I mean, what I've emphasized, as you know, is that representation always involves the consumer. There are no representations without something that uses them. You want to say what your take is on that?
Well, I'm kind of willing to use the language of use or consumer.
Mhm.
I'm not sure we would cash it out in exactly the same way. The way I want to cash it out is setting up anticipations, which have truth or falsity, or at least potentially have truth or falsity. So you seem to want to cash it out in terms of understanding or interpreting or using an isomorphism or a homomorphism or something like that.
Well, just something, yeah, something that for whom it matters whether the representations, something that is guided by that representation.
Yeah, well, I want to get it underneath that. I don't think it requires homomorphism or isomorphism, although they can be useful in some circumstances. But the bare differentiation into two possibilities of A or B seems to me to not necessarily be homomorphic or isomorphic in any structural sense to much of anything at all. But it can still be useful to a quote consumer unquote, in the sense that certain further interactions could possibly succeed in A-type environments and different, maybe even overlapping, but different sets.
So who is the consumer then? Magoo?
Well, depends on how you look at it, but the consumer in, I suppose I'd want to say Magoo, but in the microgenetic sense, the consumer is brain processes that set up these anticipations. But they're only functional in the context of the whole organism. So in that sense, yes, I would want to say it's the whole frog or Magoo. But I guess in your sense, I would want to say there are many, many, many hierarchies, heterarchies, and lattices of derivative functionality. So in this case, I would want to say that it's the microgenesis process that consumes it.
Yeah, so one thing, Mark, that I wasn't sure about is, I take it in most people who have these teleosemantic accounts of content, you have some vehicle content distinction. So you've got some vehicle that is the kind of, and it's, you know, so you've got some set of neurons firing or whatever it is that are going to be the vehicles of a particular content. But I'm wondering, how does the vehicle content distinction work? Because it's not obvious what the vehicle of content is.
Well, I said, I think a couple of weeks ago, I said, look, I take the vehicle content distinction to be completely applicable to what I'm talking about in one sense. Any three-part model of representing is going to involve vehicles, contents, and represented. Whatever vocabulary you use for it. But the sense of vehicle derives from and arose in a computationalist framework where vehicles have to be manipulable. And in that sense, there are no vehicles. So if you take vehicle to be something that possesses truth value, then yeah, there's vehicles in this model. If you thereby assume that vehicles are necessarily manipulable, then there are no vehicles in this model.
Okay, so
Make one more comment.
yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, that this goes back to the comments about the frog, for instance. I just wanted to mention that there are many things that are, what shall I say, many functions that parts of animals have or the behaviors of animals have that do not usually work the cat, how many times it pounces? Does it actually catch the mouse? I mean, the one that I love is the sperm in the vaginal canal. The job of its tail is to get it to an ovum. How many, what percentage of them, as a matter of fact, succeed? In other words, that we should not assume that functioning properly, or means succeeding, right? I mean, yeah. So the frog who's in an environment where 90% of the things there are little black spots instead of frogs, if he actually in nature, if evolution took.
Oh, you froze, Ruth.
Probably the cats.
Ruth, you froze.
She's doing this Wittgensteinian thing. She's showing rather than saying. You seem to have lost her.
I think
Yeah,
she's
so-
probably going to come back.
Yeah. So one thing though that I think there are certain types of explanations that use representations that what's trying to be explained is going to be something like robustness. And I guess though that this for you, this is what these what was the name? These were they types or
Well, Ruth is back. How about
oh, okay.
you have to unmute now?
Huh? Yeah.
Ruth? Okay.
All right, whoops, wait a minute.
Yeah, no, we can hear you. Oops, now you're not.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, I'm sorry. No, they're actually, my computer is actually misbehaving. Yeah. So what's their question for me? I'm sorry, I missed like.
Well, no, you were in the middle of something.
You were talking about sperm.
Oh, I was in the middle of something. Yeah, no, I was finished. I just wanted to point out that I really think that if we are looking at function as being something that comes down from evolution, right? That it's extremely important for us to recognize that just because something has a function doesn't mean that it usually performs it. That there are many things that have functions that they don't usually perform. They're there because once in a while they do, and oh by golly, that's what's needed. So I think that, as I say, that there would be nothing strange about saying that frog, where almost everything that came by him was a little black dot instead of a fly, that he kept misrepresenting and misrepresenting and misrepresenting. So he's got this mechanism that's designed to represent for him when there's a fly there. Most of the time it fails. And there's
Yeah,
nothing
no,
weird
I
about that.
completely agree
Weird
with
about
that.
that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. So we are already almost half an hour past our official ending time. But I
Yeah,
mean,
it's 20 past midnight here, so I'm
Oh, great,
flagging.
Scott.
Yeah, that's why I was a bit phased during the talk. It's and for Ken, and for Busse, and for Uz. Yeah, but we're not.
for Jet.
But like Richard Campbell was the real star because he was kind of regularly, I think, here till God knows when in Australia. He was kind of 4 a.m. and really kind of fully, yeah. So I'd like to thank, as the last speaker, I think I'd like to, first of all, happy birthday, Mark and Ruth. What a great way to spend your birthdays, doing philosophy, talking about interactivism.
One correction there, Lucas. My birthday is actually in November.
Ah, so this is
But
like
it
the
is
Queen.
nevertheless a celebration of my 75th birthday.
Ah,
We were taking a different time scale. It was the whole year.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good, yeah.
So you're like the Queen. You have an official birthday, and yeah.
Yeah.
But it's Ruth's birthday this weekend. Actual day.
It's mine or another Ruth?
There's another Ruth.
There's another Ruth, yeah. Oh, yes, well, happy birthday. Ruth. It's also my daughter's birthday. So.
You know, it's
I
also
should,
like,
excuse me, so long as I'm here, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everybody. I mean, this has been quite a remarkable set of, well, the whole last month. Really quite remarkable, and I've learned a great deal, and you know, it's been just really, really fun. So I thank you all. Yeah.
thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I've thanked the committee before, but let me thank the committee again. This has been an enormous amount of work, and it's come off just great.
Yeah, I was really, when they first started talking about it, I was like, no, it's a crazy idea. They'll never get it to work. And then really, it's been masterful, and like having the reading group leading up to it. So I really think that I'd really like to thank everyone involved, and especially Mark, but Urs, Jed, Adrian, Robert, Itai, and across all these different time zones. It's been really wonderful to be together with people from California to Australia to China to Turkey. Yeah, it's been really London, I guess, UK. Yeah, so it's been a really great Poland. We got a big Polish contingent. So yeah.
Lucas, your anticipations were falsified.
Yeah. I misrepresented.
And the website they created was great actually as well.
Yeah.
You know, I should also mention that in addition to the 75th birthday, this is also basically 50 years of interactivism. I keep forgetting to mention this, but I realized that at one point that the first paper that we have is like, what, 71? I mean, it's 72 maybe, but it's.
Phil, I thought we established that interactivism has been going on for 71 years when Mark turned 4 and developed reflection.
I didn't hear that.
but Jed, don't you need something like 4th level knowing to do interactivism?
Oh, he shot right through. I mean, it was just like...
it's an enabling it's an enabling factor. Once you have it, you can climb the levels. So that's what he did.
It's worse than that. You need meta reflection. We didn't even
There
talk
is no
about that.
finite number of levels. You can always go n+1.
Well, you can also reason about the relationships among the levels and not just adjacent ones, possibly.
You can go sideways.
Meta level.
Yeah, in the 86 book, these potentialities are shown to be an infinite dimensional, infinite lattice. It's not a simply ordered hierarchy.
Absolutely. Let's apply Cantor's diagonal argument. So infinitely many, indeed. Provable.
Yeah, it's a diagonalization argument, basically a counter diagonalization argument. Well,
okay. Our closing word, Mark.
Oh Lord. Well, this has been great. Thanks to everybody, not just the organizing committee. I've certainly extremely enjoyed it. I'm greatly honored by it. I've learned an enormous amount. I wish we could do this 2 or 3 times a year or something like that. But the organizing committee would probably go nuts. But
we're getting better at it. So
yeah, right.
Just
yeah, it's all your responsibility because you have the experience, right? So thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Why don't we all unmute for the clapping?
Yeah. The candles. Blow the candles.
And don't forget to make a wish.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and
Okay.
yeah, I wanted to mention also we should continue the reading group, but probably take a break. So we will email people with information about that.
For those who weren't part of the reading group beforehand, we were reading Mark's book, which is like 1,000 pages. More than that, actually. So we're like halfway through it now, I think.
We got through the first, I printed it up in 2 sections, and we just finished kind of volume 1 before we moved on to the kind of conference preparation. It's quite, yeah.
So yeah,
we're gonna
hopefully
have a
you can join us
second
too.
conference.
Yeah, and if anyone is ever thinking of coming to Turkey, we can, and once COVID is over, maybe we'll have some talks in person or in Poland.
Yeah, I mean,
or
if
in,
anyone wants to
or
risk
in
that.
Lehigh. Yeah. I mean, we can move from one. Yeah, is the recording still going? No.
Let me stop it.
You stopped?